In 1975, while I was doing this field work, and I had periods of time during the field work where I actually was lucid and I went to class. I only took classes after 2 o'clock in Buffalo. It was very cold there. I went out as little as possible. And I learned how to play the guitar and a couple of other things. But I was attracted to philosophy courses, and I was attracted to cerebral courses. And I took a 2-semester course called History and Psychology of Genocide. It was taught by some renowned scholarly professors. And for the psychology part of that course, one of the required readings was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, 1975, 41 years ago. And it had an incredible impact on me. And the only thing I could say is that I referenced it as things changed. I got into my own recovery. I continued to study and to talk about man's search for meaning. I did it in a very informal way. It was woven into the therapy that I provide. But when Rabbi Schoenbrook asked me, called me out of the clear blue, we don't know each other, I have seen his name on the Nefesh listserv. When he called me to speak at this conference, I was blown away with the Yishchacha Pratis, the reality that it's Hashem that orchestrates this world. Hashem connects the people. It's a very, very strong, fundamental tenet of recovery that Hashem runs the world. And it comes from Yiddishkeit, as the 12 steps come from, as the 2 guys who were not Jewish who got together in 1935 and were the seeds to Alcoholics Anonymous. It's all from Torah. And if that has been stated today, I just want to reiterate it. And there will be some things that I'll talk about that will be somewhat repetitive, but I think they're important and they stand repetition. Fast forward from 1975 to 1994, in the middle of my tenure at Marworth, which today continues to be a state-of-the-art secular rehab, short-term rehab for drug and alcohol, and has branched out into other addictions, but primarily is known for treating drug and alcohol. If you know anything about rehabs, you know that there's a lecture every morning, generally, at a rehab. And the patients congregate, and my job, one of my jobs as the clinical director, was to provide a couple of lectures on this every month, every 6-week lecture series. And the lecture that I became most connected with was the lecture on spirituality. If there's one thing that connects addiction with Viktor Frankl and logotherapy, and Viktor Frankl's experience in the concentration camp, as I see it, it is the essential need for spirituality. Spirituality through pain, through suffering, and there's a tremendous connection with pain and suffering for the addict, for the alcoholic. And I'm going to add for the family member. Family members have a similar pain and suffering. So in that lecture, I spoke about these 4 types of people. I spoke about the religious person who had no spirituality whatsoever. They were void of each other. Somebody who practiced ritualistic behavior, who walked the walk, but did not have a connection with spirituality. I spoke about a person who had no spirituality, had no religion, but was very, very spiritual. And I had a lot of folks in the audience that identified with that. Many people that come to a rehab have had some religious background, some very, very serious religious training from all different religions. And through a whole bunch of experiences were turned off to religion and yet had some spirituality. Some people in the audience had no spirituality and no religion. And then the fourth type of person that I saw in the world, and I mentioned to these folks that were in the rehab getting well, was the religious person who had spirituality. And as much as that was the focus for me, although I was not there to proselytize, I was there to teach people about recovery and to help people and to help the staff to provide the best recovery possible and treatment possible. If somebody was religious and could grow in their spirituality, or was spiritual and can grow in their religion, that was a very, very important part of the process. And it happens to people, not immediately, many people, but a lot of people that were religious, and I find this with Yidden, a lot of people that were religious and moved away and get well in the early days, and sometimes past the early days of their recovery, will return to a different type of Yiddishkeit, the type that includes things that they didn't have, and the whole practice and the whole gestalt of Yiddishkeit takes on a completely different meaning. And that's a bracha about addiction, because I fear to say a lot of those people would never have gotten to this level, this madrigas of connectedness with Yiddishkeit. It's very, very much in accord with Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, logotherapy, and how pain can be a catalyst for tremendous growth, tremendous change. This is not new to Yiddishkeit. This is an essential part of Yiddishkeit. Midos, the Musar movement, is all about character refinement. And addiction is generally about losing character and violating values and being involved in behaviors that really are the antithesis of midos. And addiction ends in very, very tragic ways, as we know only too well, only too recently in this culture, in this community that we live in. So what I did and what I do when I talk about spirituality is I really try and focus and help people focus not on the nebulous, intellectual, kind of confusing term, the subjective term spirituality, because it means something different to everybody. It's so subjective. I ask people to look at, and I asked those patients during that time that I was at Marworth, and then when we went to the Otskin Center and we were involved in rehab, and Ruchama Klapman was a huge, huge part of that process in introducing me back to this community in 2001, taking me from clinician to talk about the Otskin Center. What I do is I ask people to look at what does it mean to be spiritual, to talk about an action. That's what midos are about. Midos are not an ideological phenomenon in my opinion. They are a concrete, tangible set of behaviors. And so with the patients, we would go through this exercise of identifying what it means to be spiritual, to behave spiritually. And I had a big whiteboard in the front of the room, and there were 70 people sitting, and I'd ask people to just throw out, we brainstormed, if you will, to throw out characteristics about spirituality. What does it mean? What's the behavior? And people would talk about honesty. People would talk about faithfulness. People would talk about loyalty. There were all sorts of characteristics of the spiritual person. And even though it wasn't a religious, quote-unquote, religious program, it was a secular program, because the program was very much integrated with 12-step recovery, and 12-step recovery is not a religious program, but I have to tell you, there's tremendous religious connotation and verbiage. And the founders, through Hashem, the founders who were not Yidden, knew that this was going to be a stumbling block. This was going to be a set of landmines. And so they had all sorts of euphemisms and phrases, a God of our understanding, a higher power, political correctness, way before political correctness was in vogue. But it was for the preservation of the principles of this program. They knew that if they got into religion, it would be the end. Nobody would come. If they didn't make it anonymous, nobody would come. If they didn't use only first names, no one would show up. And if they started doing a lot of God talk, it was going to be trouble. And so I asked people about their conception of a higher power. And I asked them, ultimately, towards the end of the lecture, why are you here? Why did you end up here? That's really the beginning of recovery, is to look at, and it's been said prior to this talk, that that's an essential beginning when looking at one's relationship with drugs, alcohol, process addictions like gambling, sexual addiction, eating disorders. Why did you end up in this alcohol and drug rehab is what I asked. Because if you don't get to some kind of understanding that it wasn't out of the clear blue that you ended up here, and that we don't talk about why you didn't die. I was seeing people that were mixing drugs, that were involved in driving while under the influence of drugs and alcohol, that were involved in such dangerous behavior. And so we had to start there. We had to start with why you didn't die. How'd you end up here? Rabbi Wallerstein mentioned, and I'm going to just echo it. He didn't say it in the exact words, I'm going to say it. But he basically said that the actual addiction becomes a part of the solution. And there's a fellow in Israel that runs a program in Beit Shemesh, Rabbi Eckstein, who actually has coined that phrase years and years ago. The addiction was the solution to the problem. But only you have to throw in a phrase right after that, only if you're in recovery. Addiction, active addiction is not a solution in and of itself. It's only a solution once you can start to see the forest from the trees. Once you stop using. Because the use distorts and confuses everything. And so the question, why are you here? Why did you not die? What's the meaning of you being here? Is the beginning of what Viktor Frankl coined and what he came to learn in the concentration camp. There was a patient who would put pictures of his kids on a wall in his room. And there were people that said, you can't do that. If you think that's how you're going to stay sober, looking at those kids. And yet, as a staff, we believed if that's what you need to do to begin this process, to find meaning, and if that meaning is not in that I have a problem, if you're filled with denial or rationalization or other defense mechanisms, but those kids give you chizuk to be here and to keep going and to learn and to stay open, please do that. There's nothing wrong with that. I thought a great deal about the comparison, and part of my focus, I'm not sure how much I'll get to it, I'll try to integrate as much as I can, the comparison and the similarities between the prisoner in a concentration camp and an addict. And I have to say, right from the beginning, it's a very slippery slope. I have family that went through the Holocaust. I know people that are children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, and I don't think that we can be oversensitive to what it was like, and that I certainly can't fathom. Even with addiction, I cannot fathom what that life was like. I can only read about it. I can look around the room on Friday night in the shul I daven in and say to myself, We were all there. We're offspring of the Holocaust. And the connection that I have when I'm in a spiritual place is very, very congruent. But I can't claim to know what it was like. So I preface any remark about comparisons between Viktor Frankl and the prisoners that he lived with, the survivors, because it was beyond words. I want to talk about a phenomenon in recovery and talk about the biology you know, the psychology you know, some of the social components of addiction, some of the spiritual components of addiction that really are very, very important to be clear about and that are different from addict and alcoholic to addict and alcoholic. Not everybody that develops addiction has the same kind of predisposition. Not everybody comes from a home where there was alcoholism. It's easy to see when you do history and you find out there was generational alcoholism or other addictions. Not everybody comes from a place where there's personal dual diagnosis, although the recovery culture is filled with people that not only have addiction problems, but have psychiatric, emotional, behavioral, comorbid diagnosis. It's easy to see when you do a history and you hear there's a child, this adult sitting in front of you had intense social phobia and started to feel the effects of drug alcohol at a Shalom Zacher, at a bar mitzvah, at a wedding, and became a different person in being able to calm down and relax and talk to people. That person is and was a sitting duck for developing some kind of addiction. It's very easy to see when a kid grows up and the only goal he has is to please other people. And the stress and the focus is on everything other than what's good for me, that he may develop some kind of addiction. It's very easy to see when somebody suffers trauma and needs some way before they get into trauma treatment as a child, as an adolescent, as an adult, needs some way to soothe that horror, that addiction is a likely, but not always a definite, a likely antidote, and certainly not healthy. So we developed years ago this disease model of alcoholism and drug addiction. And the problem with the disease model for many people is that until you really understand what it is, it can be construed as an excuse and as a way out, as a justification. I have a disease. What do you expect? I have to drink this way. Everybody would drink this way if they had what happened to them happen to me. But that's not the disease model of addiction, of alcoholism. That's a misconceived misnomer. The disease of addiction talks about the etiology and how people gravitate to and develop these conditions. And I have to tell you, as damaging as some of the stories are, if you do this work, there are people that come from very high-functioning families and are very high-functioning, particularly in the early stages. In the early stages of chemical dependency, it is very tough to see who's who. In the late stages, a little child can tell you who's got a problem. When I was driving with my parents, beginning 1960s, through the Bowery, which doesn't even, it's called the Bowery, but it's so different than it was in the early 1960s, and I saw these Skid Row men. Didn't see women in the 1960s. And it was July, because we went to visit family members in New Jersey from Queens, and lo and behold, there were these men with old, filthy, beat-up, heavy coats in July with paper bags and bottles, and somebody said, oh, those are alcoholics. Somebody that didn't mean any harm. Somebody that said that just because they were misinformed. One of my parents. My parents are very educated people, but we didn't have alcoholism in our family that I knew. And so that was my conception of what is an alcoholic. When I saw commercials for the Rockefeller Institute somewhere around 1965 on television, and there was a big hypodermic needle in the commercial, very naturally I connected shooting drugs with addiction, that word addiction. Most people that have addiction don't shoot drugs. And most people that have problems with alcohol don't end up in that late stage Skid Row picture that I saw. So the stages of addiction are very, very important. What's germane is that the disease starts very individually, and it's nobody's natural being. It is not something that people go out to accomplish. And I think Rabbi Wallerstein mentioned this in some of his discussion with adolescents. Nobody wants to become an alcoholic. Nobody says, I'm going to become an alcoholic, develop a problem with alcoholism. It's something that happens to you if you have the right susceptibility, if you have the right ingredients. Some of them are biological, some are social, some are psychological, some are a nice mixture. And I drink. You have to drink to develop alcoholism. You can become a dry drunk. You can have a lot of traits of alcoholism that probably are parallel to family members of alcoholics without drinking. But you're not going to become an alcoholic. You're not going to become an addict of drugs unless you start using drugs. The piece that people don't get, and that we need to do the best we can in teaching, is that although one who becomes alcoholic or addicted didn't start out and consciously go to develop that problem, that person is responsible and accountable for every ounce of their behavior during the addiction and obviously after the addiction. Being responsible and accountable, which kind of usurps the whole idea of, well, I'm justified, it's an excuse. So those are concepts that are at odds with each other. There's a dialectic there, if you will. Not being the cause, not creating the initial propensity for the addiction, but being responsible for the outcome and for all the behavior that goes along with it. How do you make sense out of that? Anybody? Anybody have any ideas about that? How can it be that I can't be blamed for getting it, but I'm accountable and responsible for all the stuff that happened? And I need to clean up the wreckage of that history if I'm ever going to remain abstinent. What happens dialectically is, as with all dialectics, there's a thesis and an antithesis, an idea and then the opposite idea, and it leads to, in this case, a tremendous synthesis. And the synthesis is this recovery, this responsibility for recovery, and this need to get to the bottom of recovery. What's the definition of an alcoholic, of a drug addict? There are many. There are clinical definitions. There are folklore definitions. There may be definitions throughout the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, all the other 12-step programs. I subscribe to a very simple definition of addiction. An addict, an alcoholic, whatever euphemism you want to use to call that person a problem drinker, is somebody in whose life alcohol and or other substances has been creating problems. And I'll go further and say problems need to be equated with the process of loss, of losing things, of consequences related to the drinking and drugging. People that are social drinkers, and I have to tell you, in my experience, the world is far more filled with social drinkers and non-drinkers than with alcoholics. Sometimes people listen to somebody like me and imagine immediately, this guy probably thinks that anybody who picks up a drink has a problem. Couldn't be further from the truth. It's a way of losing credibility when professionals are on witch hunts and everybody has a problem. It's not true. Most people that drink don't have problems with alcohol. I would have trouble saying that same statement for people that use cocaine and people that use oxycodone and people that use other habit-forming chemicals that seem to have a different tendency in terms of expediting the whole progression of addiction. Marijuana is a very tough one because it seems that a certain segment of the population uses marijuana dependently, is completely hooked, if you will, and some of these people, if not many, are high achievers, functional, in our communities, go to shul, have nice jobs, a lot of cars, a lot of money, material success, are enslaved to the dependence of marijuana addiction, cannot go through a day or an evening without smoking up, and yet look pretty good. So different drugs have different progressions and different consequences. The loss is a major, major phenomenon. And what's germane to addiction in general and treatment of any level of care, whether it's outpatient, whether it's private, whether it's public, whether it's in a residential program, an IOP, an intensive outpatient program, a partial program. What's germane, what is similar in the beginning, is helping somebody to connect their loss, is helping them to connect and to identify and to really disband with the defenses that protect this loss and rationalize it and justify it and excuse it. There's a very, very, very strong school of therapy that's integrated in most treatment programs that talks about stages of change, how people change. And I see some people are aware of that model. A fellow named Miller, a fellow named Prochaska, DiClemente, years ago. This is probably going back to the late 80s, but it really took off in the 90s. And it led to brief solution-focused therapy. It led to really zeroing in on how somebody, in the topic we're talking about today, how somebody goes from being oblivious to their alcoholism or addiction, where everybody else can see it, but they can't see it, to starting to really not only understand it, but accept it, internalize it, and hence stop using. And the ultimate goal, to stay stopped. We're not just talking about stopping using, because a lot of the people that we treat are able to stop. They just can't stay stopped. Some of the people never try to stop, but there are a certain segment of the population, the active alcoholic, drug-addicted population, that actually stop, and they intend to stay stopped, but they can't. Rabbi Wallerstein spoke about this. So the stages, very simply, are number one stage, the first stage, is pre-contemplation, which basically means I'm not even thinking about this. It's not on my radar screen. Even if other people are reflecting to me, I think it'd be good for you to take a week off of drinking or a Shabbos off of drinking. Pre-contemplation. The next stage is contemplation. I'm starting to think about it. I am not at all thinking about anything past the possibility that I may have a problematic relationship. Remember, in the early stages, the loss is usually very abstract. In the late stages, it's very concrete, very tangible. You can see it. How do you measure loss of self-esteem? Especially when people, and particularly alcoholics and addicts, are so well-versed in transcending that addiction, in compartmentalizing the addiction, in rationalizing that addiction, in excusing it. The third stage of the changes of stage is preparation. I'm past contemplating. I'm now starting to prepare and learn what to do. Sometimes a person is very susceptible to going back and forth between contemplation and preparation. In pre-contemplation, there's not any preparation going on. It's off somebody's view. The preparation is very scary because what the person starts to come face to face with is the idea, I'm not going to drink and drug anymore. Finally, in the action stage, a person prepares and gets certain skills, and in my estimation, part of the preparation of learning what is necessary in the action stage, leading to the action stage, is what am I going to do in terms of my loneliness, my isolation, even if I'm involved in a huge social network. Often people that are suffering from alcoholism before they've stopped using are alone, and the amount of people around them is irrelevant. What am I going to do when I start to have cravings? What am I going to do when I start to go through withdrawal? And I'm not just talking about physical withdrawal. I'm talking about what we called in the rehab post-acute withdrawal syndrome. What's going to happen there? How am I going to get chizuk? How am I going to get identification? How am I going to get support to make it through the day? You've all heard Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous are a day-at-a-time programs, and if a day at a time is too long, it becomes a half a day at a time, and it then becomes an hour at a time if a half a day is too long. The only way that one gets from this action phase to maintenance is by stringing together days of abstinence. And days of abstinence, of not using, are very different if they're in a recovery context versus if they're in a dry context. Being dry really means just not using. It's not growing. Recovery is about growth. Recovery is about being able to connect with people and to start to turn this around. These stages of change, what do you think about them as they relate to the concentration camp, as they relate to Viktor Frankl's model, his experience? Was there any opportunity for contemplation and pre-contemplation? This was a situation, this was a phenomenon of intense oppression. How did people get to Viktor Frankl's place? How did they get to the place that he got to? Where did that come from? Where is the spirituality developed from? Where does the meaning come from? Meaning in life, and what I'm going to suggest is another paradox, and the recovery culture is filled with paradoxes. But I'm going to suggest the first step. What the founders took from the Oxford movement, which, by the way, was a Christian movement that was totally taken from bits and pieces from the Old Testament, from Yiddishkeit, and this powerlessness over, you fill in the blank. There are a bajillion 12-step programs. They all have the same 11 steps after the first step. And the first step is the same, except for one word generally. And that word for AA is alcohol. For Narcotics Anonymous, it's narcotics. For Overeaters Anonymous, it's food. For gamblers, it's gambling. So one of the cornerstones, and it gets confusing sometimes when you see a definition or a series of phrases that define addiction. One of them is, it's kind of like obsessive-compulsive behavior, but it's not obsessive-compulsive. It's not an anxiety disorder, although there's tremendous anxiety connected with addiction. It's not an anxiety disorder. What I say, addiction is a phenomenon, a condition that has obsessive-compulsive features. And in terms of what you just shared, it fits with anything that you can become obsessed and compulsive about can turn into a problem. Anything. The greatest thing. Positive things.
But there's no such thing as a good addiction.
Yeah. Addiction, in and of itself, kind of implies a powerlessness that leads to unmanageability. And that's the first step. And I can't help but think, and I can only guess, I can only project, I can only try to be there and read Viktor Frankl's mind. But part of what I believe, and some of what he wrote really does resonate with this, part of what I believe he came to was an understanding of powerlessness. That he couldn't move on into meaningfulness without some connection with powerlessness due to pain and due to suffering. Things that were outside his control. That's been alluded to in the two lectures that I heard today so far, in this afternoon's portion. So that's a major part of the 12 steps, and particularly the first step. So I'm going to read you a couple of quotes that I think they're quotes from Viktor Frankl, but they are so parallel to what happens with addiction and people in their own prisoner status in their own concentration camps. Everywhere man is confronted with fate. In the final analysis, it becomes clear that the sort of person the prisoner becomes was the result of an inner decision, not the result of the camp influences alone. The camp didn't change. It probably got worse, if anything. The torment, the torture, the inhumane treatment got worse. Viktor Frankl is who changed. And the people that he came in contact with. And again, another very important part, I believe, of the phenomenon of logotherapy and particularly man's search for meaning and his experience in the camp. This experience was connected with other people. This was not something done in an isolated way. You can daven and daven and daven and meditate all day long, and there's got to be a connection with people to make this happen. Obviously, we're going to get to it. The end of the story of these 12 steps is the 12th step, and I will speak at length about the 12th step, but the 12th step is all about finding meaning through what Rabbi Wallerstein typified at the end of his talk, helping other people. That is the 12th step. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we continued, I'll read it to you verbatim, we continued to practice these principles in all our affairs. And it's worth highlighting. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. As a result of these steps, we carried the message to other alcoholics, other gambling addicts. It's the same in every program. Other recovering people, or people that needed to be in recovery, and practice these principles in all our affairs, which really talks about continuing to grow and do mitos, not just in the dissemination and the ability to be there for other addicts and alcoholics. You can't just go on 12-step calls and help people that are in the throes of addiction and then go to the supermarket and yell at the cashier person when they're taking too long with the person in front of you. It doesn't fit. It's not consistent. There's got to be a consistency. And at the same time, people are not perfect. So this is the work that people can do, but they can't do it if they're addicts and alcoholics or active family members that are involved in the enabling and the taking care of others at the expense of themselves. You can't do this as an active person. You need to be working on stopping that behavior. I don't know how Viktor Frankl came up with this. I think some of it is straight from Hashem, but I believe there may have been a contagion with this. I believe if he was able to pass this on, it would touch other people and they too could pass it on. The words frequently came to my mind after becoming acquainted with those martyrs whose behavior in the camp, whose suffering and death bore witness to the fact that the last inner freedom cannot be lost. It can be said that they were worthy of their suffering. The way they bore their suffering was a genuine inner achievement. It is this spiritual freedom which cannot be taken away that makes life meaningful and purposeful. An addict who gets into recovery and spends most of their life as an active addict and a very limited amount of time as a recovering person would not trade anything. That time in recovery is really what life was about. And the time before recovery, unfortunately, and we can lament over this, was preparation for recovery. The way man accepts his fate and all his suffering it entails gives him ample opportunity, even under the most difficult circumstances, to add a deeper meaning to his life. There are many, many treatment programs for addiction that are called choices. If you look around, go through a phone book, you will see that choices is a very popular word. Turning point is another popular title for rehab. But I want to focus a little bit about choices and decisions and ask you to think about how that happens. How does somebody come to the realization, I've got to do something about this? How do they come face to face with this? What have you seen in your practices? What have you seen in your shuls? What have you seen in your yeshivas? How does it work? Because I said people don't wake up one morning and say, I think I want to go to my first AA meeting. It happens, but it's a very, very exceptional situation. As clinicians, one of the most important tools that I learned a long time ago, and it's easier said than done, but if it becomes a model and a framework that addiction, alcoholism, compulsive behavior that becomes problematic generally does not happen in a vacuum, then part of our role as clinicians is to coordinate this system. And so often I find the addict, the alcoholic, is not going to get well first. That's why programs like MASK, that's why programs that are family-oriented, that's why drug and alcohol family programs that will provide treatment for family members, regardless of whether the addict is interested in coming. That's why 12-step program of Al-Anon and Nar-Anon and Families Anonymous and other family-oriented, parent-oriented experiences are essential in this process. We can't wait for the addict or the alcoholic to want to get well. That's why interventions happen. Sometimes interventions are looked at as a quick fix, a painless way to help somebody, to intervene and help an identified addict, alcoholic, to get to the right place, to get to treatment. The reality is, those folks need to do work, even when they hire an interventionist. Anybody who's going to be involved in an intervention without doing a significant amount of pre-intervention work is probably looking for a Band-Aid. And it's generally not going to do the trick. For those of you who are familiar with intervention, the intervention is about the family. The alcoholic, the drug addict is an important part of the family system, but a successful intervention is not predicated on whether my husband or my wife or my kid gets into treatment. It's really predicated on whether I continue to practice the tenets of recovery. If I have therapy to do, that I get in and I do the therapy. If I need to do it with my spouse, we do it together. That's a successful intervention. So I'm going to just quickly go through the 12 steps. The first step is about powerless and unmanageability. Admitted we were powerless over, you fill in the blank, and that our lives had become unmanageable. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves. That's an action step, but it's an admitting, accepting step. And the next two steps are higher power oriented. They're about coming to believe that a power greater than oneself can help recovery, can restore us to sanity. Both addicts, alcoholics, and family members behave in an insane type way when they don't have a connection with some higher power. And if that higher power is the group, that's fine. If you have trouble or you have a patient who has trouble with God, that's okay. It doesn't rule you out of being ready to be helped. Step 3, came to a decision to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understood Him. Again, it's a higher power step that involves some kind of reliance on something, somebody outside myself. Step 4 and 5, straight from Yiddishkeit. We do this every day. We do it particularly intensively during Elul, leading up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Moral inventory. Tshuva. The Rambam has volumes. Hilchos Tshuva is a handbook for the fourth and the fifth step, as is the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which speaks specifically about the connection between resentments and a moral inventory. So often, my moral defects of character, my traits, are initially based on resentments I have towards other people. So the fourth step is about writing that out thoroughly, not in a half-hour sitting, but over a period of time, under the guidance of a sponsor. We'll talk about a sponsor in the 12th step. The fifth step, which goes with the fourth step, you hear fourth and fifth step together often, is about telling it over. It's not enough to write it out. You need to say it, not just to another person, admit it to God, to another person, and to ourselves, the exact nature of our wrongs. Incredibly important. I don't know if this fourth and fifth step was so germane in the camps. It may be something that people did introspection about as they were finding meaning, as they were relating to other people, as they were helping other people find meaning. It's terribly important to the alcoholic and the addict. These two steps are known as cleaning house steps. The sixth and seventh step are about forgiving oneself. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character, and then 7, humbly ask Him to remove our shortcomings. These steps are the most ignored steps of the 12 steps. I can't tell you. The steps that involve forgiving oneself, entirely ready to have Him remove these shortcomings, means I have to forgive myself. And many an addict and alcoholic in the thick of recovery have difficulty and in some magical way bypass these steps. And if your sponsor hasn't done a great job on these steps, he or she is going to certainly co-sign and support that and help you skip that step. You can't really do the thorough inventory if you don't forgive yourself afterwards. This is inculcated in Yiddishkeit. The 8th and the 9th step, very famous steps, are action steps about amends. The 8th step made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. This, again, is a very concrete step where you sit and you write a list of people you've harmed. You can't do that 5 minutes after getting into recovery. It takes time. You need to do the first 7 steps before you get to this amends. A lot of times people see this recovery, they feel the tremendous change that goes on, and they want to just vomit out all their amends. It doesn't have meaning until you've really, really done the steps before the inventory, until you're really with a higher power. If that's Hashem, that's Hashem. If it's somebody else or it's something else, so be it. It can change. Many an alcoholic in recovery has come to see this is all the hand of Hashem. Hashem is involved in making a decision to turn a will in our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. Those are crucial. And then there's the 10th step. The 10th, 11th, and 12th steps are really about continuing the first 9. And for that reason, they're really about maintenance. So the 10th step, continue to take a personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. This is something that people do all the time. There are people that do this throughout the day. There are people that do this in the evening. We had a 10-step group in the rehab that met every night. Patients would sit in a circle. There would actually be a staff member. There was a form that they filled out and then went around and actually shared about, who do I need to make amends with before I hit the sack tonight? Who did I wrong today? Just to go back to the 9th step for 1 second, there's for some people, especially people that are new at this, a very curious statement in the 9th step. Made direct amends to others. Say it. Except one to do so would injure them or others. It could not only the person that you're making the amends to. What's the situation when you're going to make amends to somebody and you're going to hurt them by making amends to them? The 11th step is a meditation and a prayer step. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God. Again, that phrase, as we understood him, for those people who get very uptight about God. Praying for the knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. One of the foci of 12-step is starting to really get in touch with what is Hashem's Ratzon? What's his will? What does he want? As opposed to much more of a narcissistic, egocentric focus. What do I want? Addiction is all about what I want. Getting outside oneself. And then the 12th step, which I think Viktor Frankl practiced on a daily basis and taught other people to practice, and what this recovery or survival, and I think survival is an underestimation of what happened, because I think people that practiced this hashkafa in the concentration camp were doing much more than surviving. They were living. In the face of pain and suffering, they were living. Again, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, and that spiritual awakening happens in a variety of forms. You know, the founder, Bill Wilson, in the Big Book talks about a white light that came into his detox room in Towns Hospital in Manhattan that was the spiritual awakening. It's great that he talks about that. It's very romantic and made for TV. However, there's not one alcoholic. There are many alcoholics that read that and say, I'm not going to have a spiritual awakening unless that happens to me. And we need to work with them on the myriad of ways that spiritual awakenings happen. They happen very, very slowly and subtly sometimes. The wider your eyes are open for Hashem and his work, really based on the people that come into your life and the things that happen that are out of your control, the more you are able to be in touch with a spiritual awakening. We tried to carry the message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Viktor Frankl carried this message. The alcoholic who's getting it, and to reference Rabbi Wallerstein, his work, the work of many of us that pass this on, it's about passing it on. You can't keep this if you don't give it away. Another classic recovery cliche that becomes such an important reality. You can't keep this if you don't give it away. You need to pass it on to other people. Becoming a sponsor, being a chairperson in a meeting, going on 12-step calls. Service. You will see on the coin of an AA, an NA, any 12-step recovery program that gets a coin on an anniversary, the word service. This is what Viktor Frankl did. This is what recovering people practicing the 12-step do. They do service. And they do it whether it's little or it's big. They do it humbly, but they do it consistently. And it doesn't matter how long you're in recovery. The longer you're in recovery, the more you need to be doing this. Another paradox. The longer you're in recovery, the closer you are to your next drink, some of us say. Scary, but true. I will close by telling you that when I read for, I don't know how many times, but the nth time preparing for this talk today, when I read the last paragraph of Man's Search for Meaning, the second part on logotherapy, when I read the last paragraph, I saw something that just, I had never seen it before. I didn't connect with it before if I did see it. But again, Hashkacha Pratis, a paragraph I want to read to you. Our generation is realistic, for we have come to know man as he really is. After all, man is that being who has invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also that being who has entered those gas chambers upright with the Lord's Prayer or the Shema Yisrael on his lips. Page 135 in my edition of Man's Search for Meaning. The Lord's Prayer? Are you kidding me? Where does Viktor Frankl come off referencing a prayer that is so synonymous with the 12-step culture that was typified, was created about 10 years after the first AA meeting? Rabbi Akiva said the Lord's Prayer. So there are various I have come to learn, but that he referenced the Lord's Prayer, I mean, that was the whipped cream on the cake when you asked me to be involved in this conference. That Viktor Frankl is referencing a statement, grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change. You apply what all the different scenarios in one's life that they can't change. The courage to change the things I can. The ability to find recovery, to take the cues of people around you, whether they be family members or Ravs or friends or employers or probation officers, it doesn't matter who. To change the things I can and the wisdom to know the difference. I really appreciate your attendance and thank you again for asking me to speak.